All right, so before I continue with my presentation, I just want to give a brief background to myself. So my name is Charles James Takuya Radclyffe. I'm from the Solomon Islands. I identify as Solomon Islander, born and raised there, but my links are to Kiribati through my mother's line and to England from my father. So I completed my PhD in archaeology at the University of Otago in 2020, and I'm very excited and proud to begin lecturing there at the start of this year. Over the years, my research has focused mainly on prehistoric settlement, development of exchange networks in the Western Solomon Islands, but the topic of this talk is on a growing interest of mine in cultural heritage management practices in Solomon Islands and legislation. So unfortunately, my co-presenter, Joe, as I mentioned, is not able to be here, but this paper would draw from that interest I have, and obviously my archaeological background, and Joe's legal expertise on the dynamic sort of interplay between land ownership, customary law in Solomon Islands. So I'll talk about legal pluralism shortly, just give explanation of what that is, but it's common across the Pacific, where we have our indigenous sort of laws or guidelines, and then we have the state law. Sorry. All right, so very briefly, I'll give an overview of some literature and particularly some gaps that sparked our interest in examining the interplay between archaeology and cultural heritage, archaeology and legal pluralism in the Solomons. I'll talk about what's impacting cultural heritage in Solomon Islands. It's a lot of issues that other countries will be facing. What legislation exists or really doesn't exist in Solomon Islands to protect its cultural heritage. And what does cultural heritage mean and archaeology mean for Solomon Islanders, from my perspective. I'll touch on two case studies. These are major development projects still underway in Solomon Islands. Tina Hydro and on Guadalcanal, which is the largest renewable project, development project in Solomon Islands, and the largest climate change related development project in the Pacific. As well as Bina Harbour, which is a multi-million-dollar tuna processing plant that's developing in Malaita. And I'll just touch on some concepts, cultural mapping and beneficiary mapping related to these case studies. And to finish, I just want to think about looking forward, and particularly grassroots, community-led cultural heritage management. So it can be family-led NGOs, small-scale NGOs, just thinking about how we can improve cultural heritage management in Solomon Islands, mainly through collaboration. All right, so plurilegalism, as I briefly mentioned, it's basically can be defined as the existence of multiple legal systems within a country. So Solomon Islands or Papua New Guinea or Vanuatu, so you have your common or state law, and then you have your traditional laws. So from our reading to date, a lot of the literature on this topic of plurilegalism and land ownership has mainly focused on legal studies, policy, economics, state governance, and just a growing extent gender and social factors. Some key authors, Emeritus Professor Jennifer Corrin, and several others there listed. But we noticed that it'd be interesting to get further examination on Indigenous cultural heritage. So there are a few relevant studies, particularly one by Professor Craig Forrest and Jenny Corrin, where they looked at World War II heritage. So they examined a 2010 High Court case centered on a request from a community in the Western Province, the Balele community, to cancel a license which was issued to an Australian business person exporting some World War II heritage. So the license was issued under the Protection of Wrecks and War Relics Act of 1980, and this was the first time a community in the Solomons had exercised the act to request cancelling an exporter's license. So drawing from the study, they said the people of Balele expressed concern over their removal, arguing not only that this affected future tourist potential, but also that it meant the removal of part of their history, of their province, of their people. So really importantly, the paper raises this question, whose heritage does it belong to? and I'm sure this has come up with other people's work across the Pacific. Another study, and they concluded that study, the High Court judgment of that case went in favor of the business, the exporter. Another study I want to mention by Dr. Stephanie Price, who's mainly worked as a lawyer in Solomon Islands. She's examined implementing of another piece of legislation called the Protected Areas Act, but specifically related to a natural World Heritage Site, Lake Tagano in Reno Bologna province. So just to briefly go over these, these focus mainly on World War II and natural cultural heritage. So we're saying, well, it'd be interesting to learn more about the dynamics between Indigenous cultural heritage and sort of legal pluralism and land ownership. So our main area of interest is that interplay between legal plural system in Solomon Islands and its archaeology. So a few sort of research questions guiding us so far. How is Indigenous cultural heritage defined or referred to in common? So that's state law versus the customary law. And importantly, we're going to be examining terminological conceptual differences. How fluid are archaeological sites in their nature, in their size, and their significance? And really importantly, like, who determines that? Where do we draw the line when examining that? And how is Indigenous cultural heritage managed and protected in common versus customary law? So we need to take into account differences in values. So custom, I'll talk about, and the structure of some of these authoritative bodies. So in the high courts, you have your judges, your lawyers, and then obviously in the customary law, you have your elders and your chiefs. So we take a fairly standard approach to our this ongoing research, critically reviewing some sources. So we'll draw from PACLI, so Pacific Islands Legal Information Institute, online, free to access. We will examine high court proceedings. We'll draw from local court proceedings where we can, where they're available, mainly in Honiara, and we'll touch on or focus closely on these two case studies. All right, so a map of Solomon Islands. Most of us will know where it is. But I really just wanted to highlight the extent of customary land in Solomon Islands. It's over 80% of land in Solomon Islands is customary owned. So you'd think then, okay, so most Indigenous cultural heritage is going to fall within customary law. So it's going to be dealt, using custom and traditional practices. But there's a really high degree of rural development across Solomon Islands, for logging, for example. So you always have this sort of overlap between state law and customary law. And to emphasize the extent of logging, this is a map of logging concessions from across the country. And logs, one of the biggest exports of the Solomon Islands, raw logs. But it does really, while it can provide for communities and has provided a lot to people's well-being and income of the country, it does really exacerbate a lot of these underlying issues with managing cultural heritage. All right, so how are communities and their cultural heritage being impacted? So firstly, it's really hard to accurately measure and assess this because we don't have a national database of archaeological sites in Solomon Islands. We have sort of rudimentary ones, which the Solomon Islands National Museum are doing an outstanding job in maintaining. But we're not, it'd be great to make some improvements. For example, Mohammed's talk, I believe yesterday, where he's talking about improving on these databases. So that's a key issue. But of course, like across other countries in the Pacific, your common issues or impacts are from logging, mining, large infrastructure projects, damaging or destroying archaeological sites. Climate change, of course, is a really important factor to consider. A previous report by SPREP 2018, it was mainly focused on environmental impacts, but they have highlighted some impacts to cultural heritage. So they name lack of political will, lack of human and financial resources, inadequate reporting, but particularly lack of legislation and policies. So that's sort of a key focus of our study. A few of you may remember 2021 was making global news, where Reno Bologna, where I mentioned that Natural World Heritage Site is located, was devastated. They had a terrible massive oil spill in the area, so they're dealing with that as well as impacts of logging and bauxite mining. So that's just one example. In terms of the intangible heritage, so as it's come up in previous talks and discussions, I just wanted to name a few. So obviously the loss of traditional knowledge and practices. I think one issue I've noticed when I've been in the field is the urbanization of youth. So youth leaving the villages and going into Honiara, obviously in search of a better life, of wanting to make it in the big city and improve on their education, because a lot of the schools can be quite centralized to the capital or major provinces. But a lot of that knowledge will be lost if it's not being passed down. An example, maybe one of the most famous examples of Solomon Islands of appropriation of people's cultural heritage was a song called Sweet Lullaby by the French musical group Deep Forest. So they took this song, which was a lullaby sung by late Afunakwa of Malaita, and which was recorded in the 1970s, and then they used it in their song in the early 1990s, but they wrongly attributed it to a pygmy tribe in Central Africa. So that's why you can see the image. That's from the YouTube video clip. So that's just one example. And decline and loss of indigenous languages is a really serious concern. For example, that report spread pointing out there's about 8 languages that are dying of about the 73 living languages. But there needs to be more research on that area. And really loss of traditional diet. Think of all the knowledge, all the relationships, all the processes, practices involved with traditional food making and preparation. As we're shifting towards more sort of modern and particularly processed diets, that's going to be changing. Alright, so what policies and legislation exist for the protection of cultural heritage in the country? And unfortunately it's not that much. So I've listed here, but it seems like there's a lot of sort of information, but really you've got one act there, Protected Rex and Relics Act, but really that's limited to protecting the Japanese and American heritage, so that's the World War II heritage. You've got 2 other acts, the Environment Act 1998 and Protected Act 2010. They're mainly focused on the environment. They provide sort of peripheral protection for the cultural heritage, but it's very limited. And this is our only existing national policy relevant to our sector, the cultural sector. And there are, importantly, there is a National Cultural Heritage Bill which has been drafted and which was submitted to Parliament in 2021. But because of COVID and the government's been slow, it actually hasn't been raised. So we're not making rapid progress, which we actually need. So just because I'm short of time, I won't go into much more detail. I think a really important achievement by the Ministry of Culture was the country ratified UNESCO's Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. So that was certainly an achievement. And I'll just quickly highlight just how small the fines are when you're destroying us, potentially impacting our cultural heritage. New Zealand, for example, you're going to be paying anywhere between $60,000 to $300,000 if you're going to be impacting or damaging some of the cultural heritage. So there needs to be a lot of revision in sort of the consequences in Solomon Islands. And what do cultural heritage and archaeology mean for Solomon Islanders? So if you're working in rural areas, obviously a lot of non-English speaking populations, it's not going to mean much at all. But in Solomon Islands, custom has existed, centuries, perhaps millennia, but I would recognize it as sort of a traditional form of cultural heritage management. So within custom, which you can basically define as traditional knowledge and practices, you have this deep reverence, this deep respect of the past and ancestral and natural spirits, and that's embedded within the sort of physical as well as the sort of intangible landscapes. So as part of custom, you document, you know where your sites are, you know where your ancestral places are, but it's passed down through oral histories. It's not necessarily historically documented. You also need to take care of your archaeological sites, your tumble place, because you need to be able to justify your claims, and obviously they're your ancestors, so you're caring for them. We have this traditional form of compensation when you break custom. So that's existed for a long time, and in a way, I see some of that enforcing actually being done at that sort of community and traditional level, being quite effective. But it gets complicated when you're dealing with, huge logging companies or other infrastructure. So there's Solomon Islanders we place, despite this lack of awareness, and mixed understandings, there is really high value placed on the protection and preservation of Tambu place and traditional knowledge, and other archaeologists, including my former supervisor, Professor Richard Walter, and others have demonstrated that. And that's just a photo of a cultural heritage workshop on Guadalcanal, 2012. So just briefly on the case studies, I'll just highlight we are in the sort of early stage of this research, so I haven't been able to examine in considerable detail these case studies. But I'll just mention the reason we were interested in these particular infrastructure projects was because of their scale. They're huge. But also some of the differences between the acquisition of land. So for Tina Hydro on Guadalcanal, the government enforced it, they had a compulsory acquisition of land. So that's where they declared it was legal land, but they want to acquire it for public purposes. Unlike Bina Harbour, which they've undertaken through a voluntary acquisition of land. And in terms of some of the, the methods involved, approaches for documenting some of the cultural heritage, I wanted to highlight an important limitation for Tina Hydro was that it was documented in the environment and social impact assessment done as part of the project that most of the knowledge is kept confidential. That's what some of them were insinuating. So you have to keep that in mind in terms of firstly recognizing and also being able to access some of where these sort of Tambu sites are. And just touching on the beneficiary mapping, if you haven't heard that term. So this is involved registering and recording all living persons of the land owning tribes, which I find very interesting as an archaeologist. And that's involved, taking photos, interviews, and recording genealogies. But as I highlighted, some more findings yet to come in that area. So winding up, I wanted to really just touch on and highlight some outstanding strides being made at the grassroots level by communities in Solomon Islands. So in 2014, there was registered about over 100 cultural association groups. So they're registered by the Ministry of Culture. And I have asked the current director, Ministry of Culture, for an update on that number, but I'm yet to receive one. Take into account, these can include a small dance group, a small group of artists, but it doesn't. I really just wanted to celebrate, really recognize that there are family-led NGOs, for example, Foukona in Cultural Centre in Malaita. So they've been touring around parts of Australia, performing cultural dances. But what I find really interesting is the extent of collaboration. So looking at identifying new bird species and recording other endangered animal species. So I'm also interested, as part of my research, to engage more closely with the Laru Land Conference, a tribal community. So that's based in the province of Choiseul, or its indigenous name Laru. That was founded in 1981, and it's an indigenous NGO. So I'm interested to try explore and strengthen my partnerships with them. And I wanted to mention Kulu Language Institute. So this is obviously language-focused. So it was founded in 1998 by Dr. Alpheus Zobule, who's now based at ANU, researching. And he realized that few Ranongans in Western Province, where he's from, spoke the language. So they couldn't read the language. So he wanted to improve on that. But these are just a few examples of some really outstanding work being done in the region. What are some strengths? They're provincially and rurally based. It's for and by community, and they're collaborative. But some of the weaknesses are the sustainability. So where a lot of these groups will be reliant on external support, but that's where I see archaeologists or researchers can try to provide some of that sort of expertise or collaboration. So we have a lot of talks, so I'll be winding up here, but Joe and I, we really do welcome any sort of feedback, suggestions you have. and looking and broadening. And we really hope this research will be of value just to the growing number of interdisciplinary study research that's being done in the Pacific, and obviously very central to what we all care about is that cultural heritage. So thank you, Tomas. Karabua, Bulavanaka.